Welcome to Hard Script.
The first thing I noticed was how comfortable they were laughing at me. Not awkward laughter. Not nervous. Comfortable. Like they'd done it before and expected it to land. We were sitting at a long table inside a private dining room. The kind she loved because it made her feel chosen. Low light, polished concrete. A wall of glass looking into the open kitchen. She had planned the night. Curated the guest list. Her friends. Her people. I was just the quiet accessory who paid attention to the details no one applauds. I work in data centers. I keep systems alive that no one sees until they fail. I'm used to silence. I'm used to being invisible. What I wasn't used to was being the punchline. One of her friends leaned back and said something about how I looked like the help. Another added that I should loosen up, maybe learn how to talk like someone who belonged in the room. They laughed again. Not cruel. Worse. Casual. I looked at her. She didn't stop them. She smiled. Not apologetic. Amused. Then she backed them. She said I was too sensitive. Said they were just joking. Said if I didn't like it, I could pay the bill and leave. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was already on her side. I remember noticing my phone on the table, screen lighting up with a notification from my Apple iPhone. A work alert about a cooling anomaly 3 states away. Something important. Something real. I silenced it. For the first time that night, I chose what mattered. The man sitting 2 seats down watched everything without joining in. He was older, relaxed, expensive without trying. The kind of guy who doesn't need to talk because the room adjusts around him. I'd seen him before, always orbiting her events, always welcome. A restaurant owner, someone who paid for influence the way others paid for parking. She leaned toward me and repeated it, quieter this time, like a favor. Pay the bill and leave if you don't like it. That was the moment something in me shut off. I stood up. The chair scraped louder than it should have. The table went still. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I reached into my pocket, took out the ring she'd stopped wearing unless people were watching, and set it down beside the check. I told her to use that to pay. Then I walked out. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already vibrating. I didn't look. I just drove. By the time I got home, the phone had stopped vibrating. Not because she'd calmed down, but because she'd switched tactics. Missed calls turned into messages. Short ones at first. Confused. Then sharp. Then apologetic in a way that felt rehearsed. I didn't answer any of them. I placed my keys on the counter and stood in the kitchen longer than necessary, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet I usually liked. That night it felt different. Thicker. Like it was waiting to see what I would do with it. I checked my Apple iPhone once, only to turn it face down again. 32 missed calls. A handful of messages from her friends too. None asking if I was okay. All asking what I thought I was doing. That's when another message came through. Not from her. It was from Mark. A guy I'd worked with years ago, now managing infrastructure contracts for hospitality groups. We weren't close. We didn't talk often, which is why it stood out. He said he'd been at the restaurant earlier. Said he hadn't planned to be. Said he recognized me and thought it was strange how the night ended. Then he added one line that shifted everything. He said the owner had been bragging earlier about taking care of things for my wife. About how being generous with venues and sponsorships made people loyal. About how loyalty could turn into something more if you played it right. Mark didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize it. He just said he thought I should know. I sat down without realizing I'd moved. Suddenly the laughter at the table had context. The confidence. The way she hadn't hesitated to put me in my place. The way that man had watched me like I was already gone. I opened her messages again. Read them slowly this time. Not for meaning, but for tone. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about the room. About how it looked. About damage control. One message stood out. She said I'd embarrassed her. Not that she was sorry. Not that she wanted to talk. Just that I'd made things awkward. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my banking app. Not because I planned to confront her. Because I needed to see something. Patterns don't lie. Systems don't hide intent. They only show you what you've been ignoring. There it was. Payments I didn't recognize. Charges tied to events she'd said were sponsored. Dinners she'd claimed were comps. All balanced just enough to look reasonable if you didn't ask why. I didn't feel angry. That came later. What I felt then was clarity. And once I had that, I knew I wasn't going to explain myself to anyone. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was spiraling, but because my mind had shifted into a mode I hadn't used in years. The same one I used when a system started behaving strangely and no one else noticed yet. Quiet, methodical, unemotional. At 4 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my Apple iPhone in my hand, scrolling backward through months of transactions. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was mapping behavior, frequency, timing, who paid for what, and when. That's when the story she'd been telling me stopped lining up. There were deposits I hadn't asked about. Small, clean, always just under the threshold that triggers curiosity. They landed before major events. Venues she'd claimed were favors. Catering she'd said was discounted. It wasn't theft. It was sponsorship disguised as generosity. I logged into our Chase account next. Same pattern. Money moving in ways that made sense only if you already knew the ending. I realized how carefully it had been done. Enough transparency to look innocent. Enough separation to deny intention. I opened our shared calendar. Events she'd said were last minute lined up perfectly with his restaurant openings. I checked photos she'd posted publicly. The angles were deliberate. The tags were subtle. He never appeared directly. His presence was implied through access. Then I went further back. Old messages. Not to read the words, but to notice the gaps. The hours she'd go quiet when she said she was busy. The nights she came home energized instead of tired. The way she'd started treating me like background noise instead of a partner. I didn't confront her. I didn't screenshot anything. I didn't save files or plan speeches. That wasn't the kind of leverage I needed. What I needed was separation. By sunrise, I'd already done the most important thing. I decided not to participate anymore. Not in arguments. Not in explanations. Not in the performance she was so good at controlling. When she finally came home late that morning, I pretended to be asleep. I listened to her move around the apartment, deliberately louder than necessary, waiting for me to react. I didn't. A few minutes later, my phone lit up again. Another message. She said we needed to talk. She said people were asking questions. She said I was overreacting. I turned the phone off completely. That was the moment it became real. Not to her. To me. I wasn't going to disappear dramatically. I was going to remove myself cleanly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to grab onto. I left without announcing it. No note. No message. No final look around the apartment to memorize what I was abandoning. I packed the way I shut systems down during maintenance windows. Only what mattered, nothing that would slow the process. Clothes I actually wore. My laptop. Documents. The watch my father gave me before he died. Everything else stayed exactly where it was, so there would be no immediate signal. No alarm. Just absence. I waited until she left for work. I tracked her schedule better than she thought. She lived by notifications and last-minute changes. I lived by patterns. When the door closed behind her, I moved. I transferred my remaining funds out of the joint Chase account. Not everything. Just enough to sever dependency. I froze my cards. Changed passwords she'd never bothered to learn. Logged out of every shared app. Then I turned my Apple iPhone back on, just long enough to watch the messages flood in again. Her tone had shifted. Less control. More urgency. She said she was worried. Said I was being dramatic. Said we needed to be adults. I turned the phone off again and left it on the kitchen counter. I drove west without a destination. Stopped once for coffee at a Starbucks off the highway. Sat there longer than necessary, watching people who didn't know me and didn't need anything from me. It felt unfamiliar. Clean. By nightfall, I was checked into a small hotel under my own name. The kind business travelers use because it's forgettable. I paid cash. Slept deeper than I had in months. The next morning, I changed my mailing address. Opened a new account. Contacted my company and requested a temporary reassignment. Data centers exist everywhere. Silence travels well in my line of work. By the third day, she realized this wasn't a stunt. Her messages changed again. They weren't about us anymore. They were about logistics. About embarrassment. About how people were asking where I was and why I wasn't responding. She said I was making her look unstable. That was the first honest thing she'd said. Friends started reaching out. Not to check on me, but to suggest I was being unreasonable. That I should at least explain myself. That disappearing wasn't fair. I didn't respond to any of them. From a distance, I could see the problem forming. She was used to managing perception, to shaping narratives in rooms where she had influence. My absence removed her ability to do that. You can't control someone who isn't present to react. By the end of the week, she stopped sounding angry and started sounding afraid. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. For the first time, my silence wasn't passive. It was structural. And once something like that is built, it's very hard to dismantle. I didn't reach out to him. I didn't need to. Men like that leave fingerprints everywhere without realizing it. They confuse visibility with immunity. From a rented desk in a quiet office park, I went back to doing what I'm good at. Observing systems. Stress testing assumptions. Looking for weak points no one thinks to hide because they've never been challenged. His restaurants weren't just places to eat. They were hubs. Networking venues disguised as hospitality. Investors, city officials, influencers. Money and favors move there casually, over drinks and smiles. That kind of ecosystem depends on one thing above all else: the belief that everything is clean. It rarely is. I didn't dig illegally. I didn't hack. I didn't steal. I just connected dots that were already public if you knew where to look. Permits filed late, but approved anyway. Contractors who rotated between locations. Health inspections that always landed just before big openings. Patterns that suggested help, not luck. I remembered something Mark had said months ago, back when we barely spoke. A passing comment about how hospitality margins only work when everyone plays along. I looked up the firms he mentioned. Cross-referenced addresses. Followed the trail slowly. It didn't take long. I sent nothing directly. No accusations. No messages. I just forwarded publicly available information to the right people. A compliance office here. An internal auditor there. Quietly. Neutrally. Without commentary. Then I waited. While that unfolded, I kept my distance from her life. I didn't block her. I didn't need to. Silence is louder when it's intentional. I turned my Apple iPhone on once a day, long enough to confirm there were no emergencies, then powered it down again. Her messages shifted yet again. Now they were panicked. Not about me. About things going wrong. About him being stressed. About events being postponed without explanation. She said she didn't understand why everything was suddenly unstable. I understood perfectly. What she didn't realize was that her position had always been borrowed. Her access depended on his standing. Her confidence depended on rooms he controlled. Once that structure started to wobble, her footing disappeared with it. Friends stopped inviting her out. Not openly. Just slowly. People get busy. Plans change. She wasn't the asset she used to be. One night, I checked social media out of habit. A photo from one of his restaurants was gone. Then another. Then a whole page went dark. I closed the app and went back to work. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I didn't need to. I just removed the protection he thought he'd paid for. And without that, everything he touched became visible. Including her. The collapse didn't announce itself. It arrived the way real consequences do, quietly, through canceled plans and unanswered messages. She was still posting online, still smiling in photos taken at events that felt smaller every week. The lighting wasn't as good. The rooms weren't as full. The tags didn't carry the same weight. People noticed, even if no one said anything out loud. What changed first wasn't her circle. It was her access. Venues she used to book without effort suddenly needed deposits. Sponsors stopped returning emails. A charity dinner she'd been promoting quietly disappeared from the calendar. She told people it had been rescheduled. No one corrected her. They just stopped asking. I heard about it through Mark, who reached out again without prompting. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded tired. He said the hospitality group was under review. Said investors were nervous. Said people were distancing themselves before they were asked to explain why they'd been so close. I didn't respond. A week later, her sister tried calling. Then one of her friends, the quieter one who'd never joined in at the table but never defended me either. They left messages that said she wasn't doing well, that she felt blindsided, that she didn't understand how things had unraveled so fast. They wanted me to step in, to stabilize her, to help her regain footing. I didn't. From the outside, it probably looked cruel. From the inside, it felt precise. I wasn't punishing her. I was refusing to absorb the impact of choices that weren't mine. One afternoon, I turned on my Apple iPhone and let it ring. Dozens of missed calls. Messages layered with urgency. She said people were whispering. Said someone had asked if she was still married. Said it felt like everyone was watching her lose something she couldn't name. That was the social part she'd underestimated. Status doesn't vanish with a scandal. It erodes when no one rushes to fill the silence you leave behind. At a family gathering she attended alone, someone asked where I was. Not rudely. Casually. She laughed it off. Said I was busy. Someone else asked if we were okay. She changed the subject. By the end of the night, no one asked anymore. I sat in a borrowed apartment across town, eating dinner alone, watching the city lights come on one by one. For years, I'd been invisible beside her. Now my absence had weight, and she was the one carrying it. That was the moment the room finally turned on her. Not with accusations, with indifference. Isolation doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in delays, in pauses where responses used to be immediate, in the way people stop filling space for you. She started reaching out differently, not demanding anymore, not angry. Her messages softened into questions without question marks. She said she just wanted to understand. Said she felt like she was losing everything at once and couldn't tell which part hurt the most. I read them without replying. From what I could see, she'd begun orbiting the edges of my life again. Not directly. She messaged my coworkers, asked if anyone had heard from me. She even contacted my manager, framed as concern, said she was worried something might be wrong. He forwarded it to me with a simple note asking if I was safe. I replied to him. Briefly, I said I was fine and working remotely for a while. That was enough. When she realized she couldn't reach me through work, she tried memory. Photos from earlier years. Messages that referenced moments only the two of us shared. Trips. Inside jokes. The version of us before rooms and favors and borrowed power. That was harder to ignore. Not because it worked, but because I could see the intent clearly now. She wasn't reaching for me. She was reaching for stability. One evening, I turned on my Apple iPhone and let the messages load all the way back. There were dozens I hadn't opened. I read them in order. Not emotionally. Chronologically. The pattern was obvious. Panic followed by nostalgia. Nostalgia followed by bargaining. Bargaining followed by silence. Then it started again. I powered the phone down. In my quiet apartment, there was no audience. No need to perform strength or forgiveness. Just space. I cooked simple meals. Went to bed early. Let my mind recalibrate to a life where I didn't have to anticipate someone else's needs. Through Mark, I heard the restaurant owner had stepped back from public appearances. That several partnerships were being reconsidered. That people were asking how long things like that had been going on. He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. Her world had shrunk. Not dramatically. Precisely. When she finally saw me in person, it wasn't planned. I was leaving a building downtown, head down, focused, when I sensed someone step into my path. I stopped. Looked up. She looked smaller. Not physically. Structurally. Like someone who'd lost the scaffolding that kept her upright. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't accuse. She just said my name. I nodded. Then I walked past her. Behind me, she didn't follow. She stood there, finally understanding that my silence wasn't confusion or punishment. It was a boundary she couldn't negotiate. She found a way to force a conversation without asking for one. A mutual acquaintance invited me to a small industry mixer downtown, the kind that pretends to be casual but quietly measures who still matters. I almost didn't go. Then I realized avoiding rooms forever wasn't the same as disappearing on my own terms. I arrived late, stayed near the edges, kept my phone in my pocket. She was already there. I didn't see her at first. I felt the shift before I noticed her. Conversations tightening, eyes tracking movement, the familiar tension of a room adjusting its posture. When I turned, she was standing a few steps away, watching me like she wasn't sure I was real. She waited until I was alone. No audience. No protection. She said she needed 5 minutes. Not to argue. Not to explain. Just to understand how we'd gotten here. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. My silence had already said more than words ever could. She talked anyway. About stress. About pressure. About how everything had blurred together. She said she never meant for it to cross a line. Said she didn't realize how much she'd leaned on borrowed influence until it vanished. She didn't mention him by name. I listened without interrupting. Not because I owed her patience, but because I wanted to see how far she'd go without resistance. People reveal the truth when there's nothing left to push against. She said she missed me. Not the stability. Not the safety. Me. That was when I spoke. I said very little. I said I hadn't disappeared. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. I said I wasn't angry. I was done participating. Her face changed then. Not dramatic. Subtle. Like something collapsing inward. She asked if there was still a chance. Not for the relationship she'd had. For something new. Something slower. Something honest. I looked at her and realized the power dynamic had finally inverted. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for access. I told her I wasn't there to negotiate. That whatever came next would happen without urgency or performance. That if she wanted to rebuild anything, it would be from a distance she didn't get to close on demand. She nodded like she understood, but I could see it. She'd never operated without immediate feedback before. This was unfamiliar terrain. My Apple iPhone buzzed in my pocket. A work alert. Real life, pulling me forward. I stepped past her again, this time slower. Not to punish her. To confirm something to myself. I could stand in the same room without giving anything back. That was the real confrontation. And it was already over. Her fall wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everything shattered at once. It was quieter than that. More humiliating in ways no one could film or sympathize with. She lost relevance before she lost resources. Invitations stopped coming entirely. Not even polite declines. Just nothing. People she used to message casually now took days to respond, if they responded at all. When she showed up somewhere uninvited, conversations shortened. Bodies angled away. Smiles tightened and dissolved the moment she turned her head. The man she'd tied herself to became unreachable. Not publicly disgraced. Just suddenly busy. Lawyers instead of dinners. Meetings instead of texts. His protection had limits. And once his own footing became uncertain, she was excess weight. She tried to hold herself together through routine. Same gym. Same cafes. Same carefully filtered posts. But the comments slowed. Then stopped. Visibility without validation is brutal. It turns confidence into noise. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard pieces of it. That she'd been crying at work. That she'd snapped at a junior assistant over something trivial. That she'd started arriving late, unprepared, defensive. Event management is a performance-based world. Once people sense instability, they stop trusting you with their image. She reached out again. Not with long messages this time. Just a few words. She said she felt like she was disappearing. That she didn't recognize herself anymore. That she finally understood what she'd traded away. I didn't reply. One night, my Apple iPhone lit up repeatedly. Calls stacked on calls. Messages layered with desperation. She said she couldn't sleep. That everything hurt. That she needed to see me. Not to fix things. Just to feel grounded. I turned the phone face down and let it ring. This wasn't punishment. It was consequence. I wasn't withholding comfort out of spite. I was no longer the structure absorbing the impact of her choices. That role had cost me too much. She began replaying the past publicly. Old stories. Old photos. Old gratitude. Reframed as regret. People noticed. Not with sympathy. With discomfort. There's nothing more unsettling than someone realizing too late who carried them. I saw her once more, from a distance. She looked exhausted. Smaller than before. Not because she'd lost beauty, but because she'd lost orientation. There was no audience left to tell her who she was. I felt no triumph watching that. Just confirmation. When someone builds their worth on borrowed power, collapse doesn't teach them humility. It teaches them memory. And memory is a harsh place to live alone. The last time she contacted me, it wasn't frantic. No flood of messages. No missed calls stacked like evidence. Just one notification, quiet and restrained, like she'd finally learned the language I'd been speaking all along. She said she understood now. Not everything. Just enough. She said she could see where it broke. Not the night at the restaurant, but earlier. The small moments she'd dismissed. The way I'd gone silent long before I ever left. The way I'd kept things running while she chased rooms that applauded louder. She didn't ask me to come back. She asked if I ever would have stayed. I read it once. Then again, slower. Not because I was tempted, but because it deserved accuracy. I didn't reply. By then, my life had reassembled itself into something simpler. Mornings without tension. Work that ended when it ended. Evenings that belonged to no one but me. I'd moved again, this time into a place that felt permanent. Not impressive. Stable. I still saw her name sometimes. Less often now. When I did, it was attached to smaller things. Local events. Temporary contracts. Nothing wrong with that. Just no gravity. No pull. People asked about us occasionally. Not out of curiosity, but habit. I answered honestly and briefly. We ended. No drama. No explanation. Most didn't press. They sensed the line. One night, weeks later, I ran into her by chance. No crowd. No stage. Just a quiet street and bad timing. She looked at me like someone seeing an old house they used to live in. Familiar. Untouchable. She said she hoped I was well. I nodded. I was. She waited, maybe for something more. A sign. A softening. I didn't give her one. When I walked away, I felt the finality settle, not as loss, but as closure earned the hard way. I hadn't vanished out of weakness. I'd left because staying would have meant erasing myself to preserve her illusion. I didn't disappear. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. And once you do that, you don't need revenge, explanations, or last words. Silence carries the rest. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.